Charles Manson never held a weapon on the night of August 9th, 1969. He didn't need to. He had spent 2 years dismantling his followers' sense of self and rebuilding it around his own will. The mechanism was sleep deprivation, LSD, and a belief system Manson called Helter Skelter. He taught that a race war was coming and that his family would survive it. Every act of violence was reframed as preparation. LSD sessions were not recreational. They were structured psychological events designed to create altered baseline states. When perception is chemically destabilized repeatedly, the individual loses the cognitive anchors that allow them to evaluate authority. Manson became the only stable reference point in an unstable perceptual field. This is not charisma. This is engineering. The Tate-LaBianca murders were not acts of passion. They were the logical output of a total belief architecture. This was episode 8. Charles Manson was 5 feet 2 inches tall, had no formal education beyond 8th grade, and had spent the majority of his adult life incarcerated. He was also, by every clinical measure, one of the most effective coercive controllers of the 20th century. The Tate-LaBianca murders of August 1969 were not acts of spontaneous violence. They were the calculated output of a psychological system Manson had spent years constructing. Understanding how requires separating the mythology from the mechanism. When Manson was released from Terminal Island Federal Correctional Institution in 1967, he walked directly into the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco at the peak of the Summer of Love. This convergence was not incidental. It was structurally significant. The counterculture had created a population of young people who had deliberately severed ties with their families, their institutions, and their previously held value systems. They were, as sociologist Eileen Barker would later describe such populations, seeking. Spiritually, philosophically, and communally adrift. Manson had spent years in prison studying Scientology processing techniques, Dale Carnegie, and the Bible. He arrived practiced and prepared for an audience that was already primed. LSD was central to Manson's control system, but not in the way it is typically discussed. The prevailing cultural narrative frames LSD use in the family as hedonistic or exploratory. The clinical reality is different. Manson structured LSD sessions deliberately. He guided the content of trips. He spoke during altered states, embedding interpretive frameworks into the experience. When psychedelic research pioneer Stanislav Grof described the LSD state as a non-specific amplifier of mental processes, he identified the mechanism Manson was exploiting. A destabilized perceptual state makes a person extraordinarily susceptible to the interpretive frames of nearby authority figures. Manson was always nearby. He was always the authority figure. Repeated exposure recalibrated his followers' baseline cognition. Normal perception became inaccessible. Manson's reality became default. Sleep deprivation was systematically maintained throughout the family's life at Spahn Ranch. Members slept at irregular hours, were roused for night activities, and were kept in states of chronic fatigue. This was not accidental. Sleep deprivation impairs the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for critical evaluation, impulse regulation, and long-term planning. A sleep-deprived individual experiences elevated cortisol, reduced executive function, and heightened emotional reactivity. They become easier to direct, harder to reason with, more dependent on external structure. Manson provided that structure. In the absence of functional cognition, he became the cognitive prosthetic. Helter Skelter was not merely a belief. It was a behavioral program. Manson drew from the Book of Revelation, the Beatles' White Album, and his own invented racial mythology to construct a prophecy, an imminent, apocalyptic race war in which the family would survive underground and emerge to rule a transformed world. The function of this narrative was to make violence both logical and necessary. Within the internal logic of the system, killing was not murder. It was preparation. It was prophecy fulfillment. It was, in their language, getting the slime out. Psychologist Leon Festinger's work on cognitive dissonance is instructive here. When a belief system provides the only available framework for meaning, an individual will reinterpret even the most extreme actions to preserve internal coherence. The family did not commit violence and then rationalize it. The rationalization was constructed first. Within the family, members were required to share intimate personal information with Manson. Their fears, their desires, their sexual histories, their family conflicts. This functioned as a coercive leverage system. Manson possessed information that could be used to humiliate, expose, or emotionally devastate each member. The sharing was also a bonding mechanism. The experience of mutual disclosure creates tribal cohesion. But the disclosure was asymmetric. Manson knew everything about everyone. They knew only what he chose to reveal. This information asymmetry placed Manson in a position of permanent psychological superiority over every member of the group. The Tate murders on August 9th were preceded the following night by the LaBianca murders. What is clinically significant is that different members participated on different nights. This was intentional. It served to distribute complicity. Once a member had participated in an act of violence, their psychological stake in the group's survival became absolute. Exit would mean prosecution, social annihilation, and confrontation with an act they could not integrate independently. The murders were not merely crimes. They were binding contracts. After Manson's arrest, the group's behavior did not collapse. Several members continued to advocate publicly for his release. Some shaved their heads and carved X's into their foreheads in solidarity. This behavior confuses people who expect coercive control to dissolve when the controller is removed. It does not, because the controller was never truly external. By the time of the arrests, Manson's belief system existed as internal cognitive architecture inside each member. He had been internalized. His voice was already their own. Manson's system required no sophisticated theology, no financial apparatus, no institutional structure. It required a population in transition, a chemical destabilization agent, a coherent eschatological narrative, and the systematic elimination of competing authority figures. These elements remain available in every era. The mechanism that produced the Manson family did not die with him in November 2017. It waits, as it always has, for the next convergence of conditions. This was episode 8 of the Mind Control Archives.